Okay, so this is going to be our last video this week on our slope and y-intercept stuff, our linear relationships. What we're going to be doing in this one is putting it all together, doing the magic of taking our slope and our y-intercept and making that name that I've been talking about for our linear relationships. Okay, and that name, the form that we use, or equation, so to speak, is slope-intercept form. Okay, and so that's what we're going to talk about, how we actually write those math names for our lines or our linear relationships. So, what is slope-intercept form? So, in order to identify or name linear relationships, this is what we use. And so, in order to be able to do that, this is, what we need um, to help us. Okay, we use a lot of symbols and equations in math, and so that's why it's a form or formula, so to speak, but you don't really work anything out necessarily. It's just a specific way you write it, kind of like you learn in ELA class. There's a specific way you start a professional letter to someone, or a specific way you start a personal letter. It can be a little bit more informal. There's just different forms of things. Okay, and so the equation that we use to describe a line, there's a few different ways you can write it, but in 8th grade math, we're going to focus on slope-intercept form. And so this is slope-intercept form. Y equals mx plus b. Okay, you might remember that from earlier in the school year, maybe a little bit from 7th grade math. Okay, and what's most important, what we need to realize about this is you're only going to be filling in two things into this form to tell people about the linear relationships we're looking at in a table or in a graph. And the first thing is the m. Instead of writing m, we're going to want to put a number in m's spot. Okay, and that's where our slope goes. That's that change. And it's multiplied, it's squished up against the x because, well, we know whatever's happening to our x, somehow it's changing then the y, okay? And so those get multiplied together, okay? And then our other thing is our b. Instead of having a b in the form or formula, you're going to have to put a number, y-intercept. Now, an important thing to note is, yes, when you see the formula or the form of slope-intercept, you're always going to see, sorry, I didn't mean to do that, you're always going to see a plus sign here. It's kind of generic. That's assuming that the number, your y-intercept, is positive. As we saw in the last video, or as you've been seeing on some practice problems, the y-intercept can be negative. So sometimes it'll be y equals maybe 2x and then minus 5. Okay, so just keep that in mind. It can be positive or negative for the b. Well, a lot of kids are like, well, that's all we do. We just put numbers there. And so, yeah, it really is just that easy. You just figure out your number for slope, and figure out your number for the y-intercepts. And you just put the numbers in the place of the letter that they match with. So once you figure out your slope, you just got to remember that slope is like the m, the movement, the change in your problem, or the change in the graph, the way the line is moving in your graph, so to speak. That's a good way to think about it. Okay, and then the B, that's your beginning. I've been using that, and that's kind of why I've been using that to tie into this form, y equals mx plus b. Okay, your slope intercept is that b part, or excuse me, your y-intercept is that b part. Okay, so once you know the slope, you put in m. Once you know the y-intercept, you just put it in b spot. And that's how you write your name or the equation for a line. Okay, so yeah, the plugging it in's easy. You just got to be able to do all the other things. Find the slope, find the y-intercept. So let's look at an example. What's the equation in slope-intercept form that this table represents? So here we have a table of x and y values. In order to write slope-intercept form, we need slope and the y-intercept. Right, so let's start by finding the slope. Just like you did when you weren't putting it all together, we're going to find the slope by comparing our change in our y values, how these are changing each time, compared to how our x values are changing. So notice your x values are going up by 2 each time, and your y values are decreasing. We're getting smaller in number by 6. So when we go ahead and write that change in y, we always make sure we put our dependent on top, change in y, that negative 6, over our change in x, positive 2, we get a negative 3 for our slope. So now I know that negative 3 is going to be that number that goes in M spot. That's the movement. That's the amount of change in my problem or in my situation. Okay, so now we need to be able to identify that y-intercept in the table. And we talked about when x is 0, that's when it will intercept the y-axis, when x is 0. So right here, x is 0 and y is 6. So that means the y-intercept is 6. So in B's place, we're going to use 6. So now that we have all that, let's put it together and write the equation. So we need to change out M and change out B. And so in M spot, we're going to take this negative 3 that we figured out and we're going to plug it in here. So it would be y equals negative 3 and then x right after that. And then B is 6, so we'll need to put that here. And since it's positive, it will say a plus sign. So if I can get that little pop-up to go away, you'll see the final answer. Y equals negative 3x plus 6. And that's all you have to do. People who understand slope-intercept form and know about it, they will be able to look at that and say, oh, wow, yeah, it has a negative, it's decreasing by 3 each time, but look, it did start in the positive. You know, the business originally was, you know, still making money, and then it was decreasing each year or something to that effect, whatever the situation might be. Alright, so let's look at another example. This one, we want to know what is the equation in slope-intercept form that this graph represents. So whether you're looking at a table, whether you're looking at a graph, we want to be able to do it all. We want to be able to look at this graph and say, okay, I can figure out the slope, I can figure out the y-intercept, because those are the things that I know how to figure out about my line, my linear relationships, and then I can put them where they belong to make the name. Right? Kind of like your first and last name. You wouldn't want me to switch them. They belong in a certain way, in order, in a certain place. That's what we're doing here in our slope-intercept form. We're putting the name together. So first we'll look at slope. And on the graph, remember, we think about it as rise over run. Okay? How are we going to do that, though? We talked about counting and seeing the change from one point to another. I don't see any points identified on here. In my last video, I talked to you about how we don't use things like this because this is in between 3 and 4 on the x-axis. I don't know exactly where it is. So I want to use things like this point because it's right where an x and a y line cross. That's what we're looking for. So first, in order to count that rise over run, we need to pick points. I went ahead and picked these points. Okay, there might be some closer together you could use. There might be some farther apart. These aren't the two that you have to use. If everybody uses different ones, but they're good points and they're on the same line, we'll all get the same answer in the end. Okay, so I need to figure out how to change from this one to this one. So our rise first will be 1, 2, 3, 4, it looks like. Yep, up 4, we're going up, so that's a positive for our rise. And then we're not quite to that point yet. We still need to do a little bit more changing by going to the right too. Right is a positive direction. We're going more positive on the number line. So that's a positive 2. So we have 4 over 2. When you divide that or simplify, we get 2. And notice that's positive. This time it's facing to the right. Looks like it's increasing. It's a positive slope, positive graph. Alright, so we know our slope, that's part of our battle, right? That M, we've got that, slope is 2. Now we need to figure out that y-intercept. Okay, when x is 0, what's that y value? Here's x of 0. That means literally it's got to be somewhere here. Okay, we can pick out the y-intercept by just finding where my line touches that y-axis, and it touches right there. So that is going to be our our y-intercept, which is negative 1, 2, 3. All right, so now if we go ahead and put it all together, once you know your slope, you have 2 for m, we're going to put that in m spot. Once we know our y-intercept, we got -3, we'll put that in B spot. Nothing keeps popping up. So that means we end up with y equals 2 in m spot x minus. Now again, remember, we talked about that plus in the form is assuming that your y-intercept is going to be positive. Because our y-intercept is a negative value down here on the y-axis below 0, we're going to need to, instead of having the plus, put the minus. Now some students say, well, can I put the plus and then -3 in parentheses? Sure, but it's kind of like saying something twice. Kind of silly, but however you prefer, the point is the world needs to know that it's down at the bottom. It's below 0 for the y-intercept. Okay, that's important. That's telling us that the business started negative, so to speak, and then is climbing up, increasing, maybe $200 an hour or something like that. So we need to make sure that we use the right name and we show that that's a negative number. Okay. All right, well, I hope this helped you remember how to put it all together and fill in the form, the equation, and that it will make some of your work this week easier. Have a great week, Luna Longhorns.